I am Dr. Mahammad Rafi, Associate Professor, Department of Cyber Security at Institute of Aeronautical Engineering. Today I want to discuss about problem solvings, questions on TCP and UDP protocols. The content is problem solvings on TCP and UDP protocol. Here is the problem solving questions. The first question is, demonstrate the use of the TCP and UDP protocol. How the problem is, how we are utilizing the TCP protocol and UDP protocol in a networking for establishing the communication. Here, utilization. So it is the issue, how it is resolving this issue. So that is the problem, how can you resolve? That means TCP is a transmission control of the protocol. So it is a connection oriented protocol. That means, meaning of the connection oriented means, before transmitting the data from source to destination, we have to establish the connection between source and destination. After establishing the connection between source and destination, the packets can be transferred. The packets can be transferred from source to other destination. So this is a connection oriented protocol. That is a TCP. So which ensures reliable communication between a client and a server. Here the connection is very reliable between the client system and server other system. It guarantees that the data can be sent from one end to the other end. So which is received in the correct order and without the errors. So this is a TCP protocol. Here is the code for this TCP client server application. At server side, the TCP as a protocol, how can you implement the TCP protocol? Here is the Python code for the implementation of the TCP at client side. That is import socket TCP server function, now which is importing the sockets. Socket now with help of this importing of the socket, now we can receive the data and send the data with help of the TCP protocol at server side. Here is, now we are writing the TCP, implementing the TCP at server side. For that, now we have to creating the TCP IP sockets. TCP IP socket. Here is transmission control and internet as the protocol of the socket now. So these are the server socket. The function is server dot socket. The arguments, now we can utilize the socket dot AF inet and socket dot socket as a streaming. So these are arguments can be utilized. Bind the socket to the address and port. Here is the binding. Now why you are going to the binding the address and port means, every host at server side, every other system which is having the address and port number. With help of this address, IP address and port number, we can identify the other device and transmitting the other data to particular identified other device. Here is the address. Local host address. Local host address means it is considered as a IP address, that is 192.168.8.0. So this is the address. Along with this, now we have to identify the port number of the device. The port number of the device is, this is a port number of the device. The port number is 650 432 is a port number of the other device. Server socket bind server address. Here is which is binding the address along with the port number. So then only if you bind the server, then only here we can establish the connection with the client. Once the bind is completed, the connection can be established with the other client. So which is listening for the incoming connection. Here incoming connection, that means server socket listen 1. That means print TCP server listen on port 650432. So this is the port number now, it can be listen. Where if it is listening is a true and the waiting for the connection with the client device. Whatever the client device is going to establish the connection which is waiting for the connection. For establishing the connection, the function is connection client address. That is equals to server socket accept. Server socket dot accept now which is trying to the connection from client address. So that means which receives the data in a small chunks and retransmit it. Here is whatever the small chunk of data received, it will be transmit after resolving the other solution. While if it is true, the data retransmission chunks is the true here. Now the receiving the data, whatever the data we are transmitted, the server can be receives the data with help of this function. The function, the code for this one is in a Python. Now you can write the code as connection dot receive 1024. 1024 it is a port number of the device. So and so particular port number of the device. With help of this the port number only we can receive the other data. If data, that is a print F received data dot decode. That means the connection dot send all data. Connection dot send all other data. Else if it is the connection is established, sending the all data to the server. If it is completed, otherwise here if it is not true, break the system. We can't send the any data from client to server. So finally after completing the transaction at server side, what we are doing, so clean up the connection. That is the cleanup connection can be done with help of the connection dot close. If name is equals to main and the connection dot close can be done at server side. At server side, we are using the TCP protocol. Whatever the transmission control protocol we are using at server side, now we are closing that other connection. Here is importing socket. Importing the socket at client side. How we are going to importing the socket at client side? How with help of this other socket, now how we are going to transmitting at a client side? Data, how you are receiving the data, how you are going to transmitting the data. Generally here, these the clients can be utilized for transmitting and receiving the data at client side, at server side. For that one here, the header files now, the definition, we can write this as the definition, the method TCP client. TCP client means here, this is the function now, which is defining at the client side only. And creating the TCP IP socket at client side. For that, the function is client socket. Socket is creating at client side. So, which is the TCP, the protocol. We are with the help of this the TCP protocol via this the client, via this the socket. Now we can transfer the data. So that is socket dot socket. That is a socket AF underscore inet socket dot sock underscore stream. That means connecting the socket to the server, the port. Here, whatever the server ports now we are utilizing, that server port, the socket can be connected to the server port. That server port number is a 65432 server port. So with help of this server port number and IP address of the server is 192. The IP address of the server is 192.168.0.1. So this is the address of the server, and the port number is a 65432. With help of this the port the number now, the connection can be done at the client other side. Here is server address localhost 65432 is the port number. The function for the connection establishment is a client the socket the connector server address, and trying. So trying what it is doing, the sending the data. Here for that what data it is sending, the message is equals to hello TCP server. This message is the sending from the other client. Here for that now sending, the function is print. Print means now which is displaying to the end user. So we are writing it as sending the message. The message is what the message we are sending is hello TCP server message we are sending from the server to client. Server to client. So that's why the socket now we are going to implementing the socket at a client side. At a client side now we are going to implementing the socket. Here looking for the response. After the connection, after sending the message from client to the server, the client is waiting for response. Now it is waiting for the response. For that now, response waiting, we are writing it as receive dot decoding can be done. And finally, if it is responded, decoded, original the message is got, the server at the server side. Now, with help of this the port number, that is 1024. Once if it is the response is cleared, response is received, receiving is very clear, then immediately we can close the socket at the client side. For that one, now we are using the function as client socket dot close. By using this the function now we can close. Here TCP is closed at the client side. UDP protocol. So like this now, TCP, whatever the problem is solved by creating the TCP sockets at client side at server side. Now the problem is resolved. The communication problem is resolved by creating the TCP socket at client side and server side. So it is a connection oriented. So with the connection only, after connection only, now we can transfer the other data. Here is UDP protocol, user datagram protocol. User datagram protocol is a connectionless protocol. Connectionless other protocol. So this user datagram protocol is a connectionless protocol. So that is a faster, very faster, but does not guarantee the reliable other communication. So it is often used for the applications where speed is the more critical than the reliability, such as video streaming or online gaming. So these are all the applications of the UDP protocol. That is a wireless communication now. In wireless communication, we have to create the UDP sockets at client side and server side. By creating the client UDP the sockets at client side and server side, now we have to establish the communications effectively from client to the server. For that now UDP server side, UDP the sockets, how we are creating at server side. For that the implementation, the code implementation for solving that the problem is import socket and the defining the UDP server side. User datagram is the defining at server side. So this is the function creating the UDP sockets at server side. For that now the function is sockets server underscore the socket and server dot socket dot here is a socket dot socket. So at a server side we are creating, that is a socket dot AF inet family address the family internet. Here it is a inet address the family. That means we are writing the it won't change. AF inet and the socket D gram DG the gram socket datagrams. So user datagrams now, it is won't change. It is a fixed. While creating the this UDP the protocols at a server side. So these arguments are the fixed. With help of these other arguments now, socket linking the function now, we can create the UDP as a socket at a server side. After creating the socket at server side, now what we are doing, binding the socket. So always know whenever we are going to binding the socket, we have to utilize the IP address plus port number. With help of this IP address and port number, with help of this IP address and port number, we can bind the sockets. Once if it is the bind the sockets immediately, which is identify the IP address and port number of the particular host and receiving the other data. So that means here server address, that is a local host 65432. 65432. That means here server socket dot the bind server I address, server underscore address. So it is print UDP server listening on port 65432. 654 the port now, which is listening the services and receiving the services from the other client. If it is a true, while it is a true, waiting for the connection. Waiting for the connection from the other client. And here is the client with help of this client, with help of this address, client address now, the data can be transferred. Once the data is the transferring, whatever the data it is transferring here, so the server the socket now which is receiving with help of this particular the port, from this the port 1024 is a port number of the client. From that other client now which is receiving the data. So this is which the client and port number. Based on this the client IP address and port number, the server is which is receiving the data. After receiving the data, now it is printing received data can be decoded from the client to addresses. Here is sending the data back to the other client. If the data, that means now if it is a data is the send, we can write the function as a send server socket send to. With help of this the data, now we can sending the data from the client with help of the address and port number. We are sending the data from client to server. Here at the server side, we have created the UDP sockets. This UDP socket, it is a wireless the communication the socket. So whatever the data you are transmitting from the client without the connection, without requiring the other connection, the data can be transferred to the server. Here print send data decoding back to the client addresses. After it is now it is back into the connection. So UDP server is created. At client side also now we are creating the UDP socket. Here for that now we are defining the UDP socket at client side, importing the socket. With help of this importing socket now we can sending the data and receiving the response from the server, sending the data to the server and receiving the response from the other server with help of this import other socket. And create a UDP socket. Create UDP socket means now once if you create the UDP socket without the connection, that is a wireless communication can be done from one device to the another other device. The best example is a mobile communication. That is client the socket, that is a socket dot the socket af.net and socket sock underscore dg ram. Here with help of this code, now we can creating the socket at client side. For that here the server address, that is local host and port number can be assigned to the server address. Local host comma, these are the port number which indicating the message is coming from this local host which is having some IP address. With the combination of this the IP address and the port number, we are sending the message to the server that can be assigned. So and so server now we are going to sending. The message is coming from so and so local host which is trying to catch that message. Whatever the message is coming, so respond is the coming now, which is try. Here is sending the data. Once the client it is sends the data, so we are creating the one message the object here. So this message now we are utilizing the hello UDP server. So hello UDP server is assigned to the other message and print sending message. That means print sending message now, which is transferring the hello UDP the server to the from the client to the other server. Here is client sent client socket sent to the message dot encoding and server addressing. So receiving the response, that is server is equals to client dot receive from 1020. So response is received. So and so the port number, so that is we are assigning to the server. Print receive data is decoded. After the decoding here, now data will be received. Finally now, if response is received at client side from the server, if it is effectively completed, now we can close the connection. For closing the connection, the code is client socket dot close. Here is UDP the client. That means the connection will be closed. So generally here, how to run the TCP and the UDP? That means we are save the TCP server code to a file name. First, whatever the TCP code now we have written, that can be saved in a Python. So that is TCP server .py. It is a, so in this file name now, by utilizing .py, we can save the files. And TCP client code to the file name is giving it as a TCP client .py. TCP server .py is a server code and TCP client.py is a client code. Save the UDP server code to the file name, that is UDP server.py. So this is a UDP server.py, and save the UDP client code to a file name, that is UDP client.py. Now open the 4 separate terminal windows. So here the first terminal now, which is indicating the TCP underscore server.py, Python TCP client underscore .py, and third the terminal run the UDP server. That is, we can run the UDP server Python UDP server.py, and we can run the UDP client with help of the Python UDP client.py. Here this will be demonstrated the basic use of the TCP and UDP for client server communication. By creating TCP UDP, now we can communicate. The comparison, the second the problem is the second question is a compare TCP and UDP. Here generally we can compare the TCP the IP, these are the protocols in terms of the characteristics, advantages, disadvantages, typical use cases, transport layer of the internet protocol show. Here TCP, transmission control protocol. The characteristics are of the transmission control protocol is a, so it is a connection oriented protocol. So which is establish the connection by using the 3-way handshaking. That is a synchronous acknowledgement and acknowledgement. So it is a very reliable. TCP control, the TCP the protocol is a very reliable, and which ensures the data reachable to the destination without errors. So in the correct order and without the duplications. Flow controls. The flow controls means now which is manage the rate of data transmission. So between the sender and the receiver to prevent the congestions. So error checking. Error checking means now which is uses the checksum for error detection and error corrections. Congestion control is a main characteristics. So which is adjusting the rate flow between the two other networks and depends upon the traffic conditions. Here advantages, the reliability and error handling are the advantages, and disadvantages are the overhead and latency are the disadvantages. So these are all the web browsing, email, file transfer now we can utilize. So this is a connection less, unreliable data flow, no flow control is a characteristics of UDP. Speed and efficiency, the advantages of the UDP. Disadvantages are reliable and no congestion other control. So these are all the use cases. Real-time applications, broad and multicast transmission, DNS, simple network other management. So these two are the references for this other topic, and this is the web references for problems solving on a TCP and UDP protocols. Thank you.
Like, share and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for more updates.